Hey guys, Coach Brandon here again. Welcome back for another episode of our journey through the biblical story. And this week we're jumping into a couple of passages from the book of Amos. And some of you may not know who the prophet Amos is or have ever read his book, but I highly recommend it if you get some time. We're going to spend a little bit of time here today as we continue our journey. And so, the last story that we covered was the story of Elijah, from 1 Kings 18, and his duel on Mount Carmel, where he called, Ahab and the prophets of Baal to kind of account and put this duel before them, where there were sacrifices, where they were to call on their gods, and the God that answered by fire was the true one and true God. And lo and behold, God Yahweh answers by fire in that story. Well, we also learned that the kings progressively were getting worse. Ahab happened to be the worst up to that point, and God raises up. I mean, there had been prophets, but it's like the office of prophet was really instituted with Elijah, and it kind of continues through. It's God's chosen instrument to speak to the people, to speak to the kings. And here he raises up a young man named Amos. And what kind of makes Amos a little peculiar, unique, familiar, is that he was not a prophet. So in his book, he says, I didn't go to the school of the prophets. I wasn't the son of a prophet. He was a sycamore farmer. And God calls him out of that place, and he's going to be a prophet primarily to the northern kingdom of Israel. He lives in the southern kingdom in Judah, but is going to preach primarily to the northern kingdom. And that's where his message is going to go. And that's where we arrive at today. So we're just kind of taking a journey through the prophets, kind of understanding what is the decline, because really kind of what we're leading up to, and we'll see in our next lesson, is the exile of the Israelites out of Jerusalem into Babylon. I mean, how did things get that bad? What was going on? And so not only do we see these negative kings as we saw from our story last time, but as we jump into today's story, we're going to see some things, we're going to see God's heart for justice. And that justice is really coming against kind of corporate sin. And, we have our own individual sins. All of us do, right? But there's something interesting when we think about corporate sin. Or systemic sin, being a part of like an organization or a movement or just kind of a culture or a way of things are going, where you yourself may not be, sinning that much, or you've cleaned up and transformed your life. But what we're not coming against kind of the injustices that take advantage and oppress, the most vulnerable in our communities, in our churches, wherever it might be. And that's really what Amos is coming against here. And that's our theme, is really justice, is God's justice and God's heart for justice. And see, justice isn't just simply, like retribution. It's not like an eye for an eye. I mean, even though that's how God starts it out, so we could kind of get a handle on it, right? We kind of look at justice today. If somebody commits a crime, you do the time, right? Whatever that might be. We see those that are put in jail for long amounts of time for the crimes that they committed. And many of us are satisfied with that kind of justice. And while I'm not advocating to release all the prisoners from prison, what I am trying to lean on here is God's justice is different. It's restorative. It brings both parties back to wholeness. Now, that doesn't mean that you get back what was lost. I mean, if somebody takes a life, you're not going to get that life back. That's not what we mean by God's restorative justice. But we want to try to restore people to wholeness, right? To we want to have them change their ways. We want them to be somebody who is part of God's kingdom, right? And I mean, so there's a hard thing here to go after when it relates to God's justice, but that's what God desires, and we see that played out in some of the stories that are found in Amos. And we're going to take a look at two specific passages from there, if you want to look them up. The first passage is from Amos 2, verses 6 through 8, and the other one is from Amos 5, verses 10 to 15. So those are what we're going to look at. And a little background here is, as we're thinking about it, from a prophetic oracle, when an oracle is given, when there is usually a statement from the prophet to the people from God, there's usually these four elements. They're not in every prophetic oracle, but they kind of help us wrap our mind around the purpose and the point of what the prophet is saying. And the first element is always that the Lord is speaking, right? So a lot of things that we see in the Old Testament from the prophets is thus saith the Lord, right? It's not a human person who's trying to come forward and say this. It's something that God has directly said, a direct message that's been given to the prophet to then be delivered to the people. And so that's the first element that we usually see in all of these prophetic oracles. The second element that we see in there is that when God is giving this prophetic oracle, he's describing the sin. He's describing the injustice that Israel has committed. He's basically telling them what they did wrong, right? And it's not punitive, but he wants them to know that he sees it, that this is actually what I'm addressing when I talk about this. That's why Israel's sin is described. And the third element that we'll see is the consequence and the judgment if Israel continues to partake in this behavior, partake in this sin. This is Israel and Judah, and we're talking about the kingdoms that have been split. And so this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen to you if you don't repent, if you don't change. And the fourth element that we see is this promise to avert judgment if the people repent. So God is always like, if you change your ways, then this is what I'll do. Well, I'll either avert the judgment I had, or I'll bring blessing to you. So this is how these are all laid out. God is seeking to call his people back. Sometimes these prophetic elements don't have that promise to avert judgment, simply because it's too late. God is already pronouncing his judgment. And we'll see this repeated when we get into the book of Revelation, as we see the words that Jesus gives to John to write to the churches. So this is a pattern that is repeated, throughout the Bible. That God is the one that's speaking. He's describing the injustice or the sin that has been committed, the consequences for continuing to walk in that sin, and then a promise to avert judgment if the people repent. Which, again, like I said, sometimes these are not all present in the prophetic oracles, but they are present in our scriptures today. And I mean, if you read those two different scriptures, you're going to see that there's really some corporate sin that Amos is speaking against. He's speaking against government. He's speaking against rich people. He's speaking against those that are in power that can cause oppression. He's speaking against kind of the court system at the time, where people aren't really seeking justice. They're just seeking their backhanded deals, and whatnot. And they're continuing to oppress the vulnerable. I mean, so those that don't have a voice already because they're poor or because they don't have status, the people are just continuing to oppress them. And not only that, like they're taking advantage of it. In some of these stories, you see that fathers and sons are sleeping with, girls inside the temple. I mean, while they're trying to, administer justice to the people around them. So it's just kind of a perverted sense of understanding people's power. And here, Amos is sent to deliver that message against the corporate sin of the people, to seek God's restorative justice to the people. And yeah, that is, we don't understand that about God, that God has a heart for justice, and a true heart to see restorative justice. It's not just about Bible thumping. It's not about flag waving. It's not about any of that kind of stuff. It's about it's restorative justice, where both parties can come together and work for the flourishing of humankind. It's not about just being better than the other. But part of that is really speaking out the truth of the injustice that is there. And I think some have tried to do this in our cultural day and age and have been silenced. Others have been branded, on both sides, trying to speak well or to speak towards a place, of justice. But I think we all need to redefine what it means to seek after true restorative justice and not kind of just punitive justice. And so what does it say kind of about our God? who seeks this kind of restorative justice. I mean, well, it's not only that, it means that God sees the oppressed, the downcast, the marginalized, and he is for them, right? I mean, and more than that, he actually becomes one of them. When Jesus comes on the scene, we see that Jesus wasn't born in an opulent palace. He didn't come from riches. He didn't have a place to lay his head. His parents weren't the most wealthy, and they sure didn't have a good name because of nobody believing Mary's, conception and the way it went. And so God becomes one of them. He becomes one of us, and that is incredible. That God just doesn't see it. He said, "I'm gonna go make my." I'm going to go, live amongst them in such a way. And, the religious elite thought that just couldn't happen, that God wouldn't do that. So this is the God that we have, and wants to see both sides restored to a place of higher ethics, of higher, kind of a higher worldview, where it's not an us versus them. It's kind of like, let's remove the barriers that draw us apart, and and try to figure out what draws us together in unity and into flourishing. And it's human nature for the dominance. It's human nature for to have the oppression. Once we get a taste of power, we want to hold on to that power. And God is all about giving that power away. Jesus left the throne of heaven that he might descend to earth, and again, become one of us. He gave up all of that so that he might live, as one of us. And so this is the God that we follow. One that would call someone who wasn't of the pedigree, per se. He wasn't the son of a prophet. He wasn't from the school of prophets. But God said, I'm going to call you. So let that be hopeful to all those who don't feel that they could be called by God. It doesn't really matter what your background is. God can call you to do amazing things. And he might be calling you to speak out against the injustice that is happening to the poor and the marginalized in our world today. What would it be like to give voice to the voiceless out there? And I think our God is one that seeks to do that through his people. He wants those to speak a word to those in power, those that are oppressing, and make the justice known. Not only that, but to work towards the restorative justice of all parties. This is a God that cares, that sees, that is actively involved, that is raising up leaders to speak, that is empowering them to speak, that is giving them the words to speak, right? You don't have to feel like that you have talents and giftings and pedigree and money and wealth. If God desires you to go call this word, he's going to provide the way. He's going to make the way. He's going to give you the words. And ultimately, it's his result on the impact. And so this is the God that we follow. And as we travel through the book of the prophets, Amos is one of the 12 minor prophets. As we're leading our way towards the Babylonian exile, we're seeing that the prophets were raised up to call out against Israel's sin. They were supposed to be different than the people around them. And unfortunately, many times they look just like their surrounding neighbors. So what is our challenge this week? Our challenge this week is can we see the injustices that are going on? Can we see the corporate sin that is pervasive in our cultures? Doesn't matter what culture you're from. Do you have eyes to see the injustices that are out there, the poor and the marginalized that are oppressed? As I think about it, we have a homeless population here where I live, and I think it's a pandemic, an epidemic, around our nation, if not around the world. And the solutions that we're coming up with aren't working. But I think we're trying to do it on human terms, and we're not really looking at the systems, at the root of the problem. It's one thing, to kind of deal with the homelessness as it is happening, but what puts people there? How do people end up there? What are the societal norms and barriers and blockades that create that kind of reality, and then hold people in that reality, that make it hard for them to transition back the other direction? These are tough questions, and I'm not saying I have answers, but I think it's about time we start asking different questions, and then we rely on God for innovative responses in order to tackle the problems that we have in our world today. That's our challenge. Can you see the injustice? Can it break your heart? And then can we, in our spheres of influence, lean on God to have him give us his words about solving some of these problems that we have and taking a step in that direction? Just 10% outside of your comfort zone, right? With your group of influence. Unless God's calling you to do, major things. If we all just do 10%, we're going to get pretty far. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Remember to like and subscribe. If you have questions, comments, please, leave them. I'd love to interact with you. As always, if there's a story or theme that you'd love me to go into, by all means, let me know, and we'll see about getting a video done for that. And as always, I continue to pray for you all that your relationship with God is growing more intimate, dependent, and deep as the days go on. And as always, until next time, I hope you continue to find your place in God's story.